The house stood at the end of Harbinger Lane, shrouded in perpetual twilight. Its silhouette loomed ominously against the dimming sky, a relic of a bygone era that seemed to resist the passage of time. The air around it was thick with an unsettling stillness, as if the house itself held its breath, waiting. Towering oaks, their branches gnarled and skeletal, blotted out the sun. These ancient sentinels seemed to guard the house, their twisted limbs casting eerie shadows that danced on the ground like spectres. The trees whispered secrets to those who dared to listen, their leaves rustling with tales of the past. The paint peeled from the siding like scabs, revealing the rotting wood beneath. Each flake of paint that fell was a testament to the years of neglect, a silent cry for the care that never came. The house's exterior, once proud and stately, now stood as a monument to decay and abandonment. Windows, once bright eyes, were now vacant sockets staring out blankly. They seemed to follow you no matter where you stood, as if the house itself was watching, judging. The broken glass glinted in the dim light, adding to the sense of desolation and despair. This was a place where shadows lingered, where whispers danced on the wind, where secrets festered like wounds. The overgrown foliage seemed to encroach upon the house, as if nature itself sought to reclaim what had been abandoned. The wind carried with it the faintest echoes of laughter and sobs, memories of lives long past. Inside, dust lay thick as a shroud. It covered every surface, a testament to the years of silence and stillness. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and age, a reminder of the life that once thrived within these walls. It coated the furniture, the faded floral wallpaper, the cracked porcelain dolls lining the dusty shelves. Each item told a story, a fragment of a life once lived. The dolls, with their lifeless eyes and cracked faces, seemed to watch over the room, guardians of forgotten memories. The air hung heavy, thick with the scent of decay and the weight of forgotten memories. Every breath taken within these walls felt like inhaling the past, a past that refused to be forgotten. The decay was not just physical but emotional, a lingering sorrow that permeated every corner. Each room held a palpable emptiness, a void that seemed to suck the very life out of anything that dared to enter. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards, as if the house itself was shifting, restless. The house on Harbinger Lane was more than just an empty vessel. It was a repository of emotions, a place where the past and present coexisted in a delicate balance. The very walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own, a life that was both haunting and mesmerizing. It was a living, breathing entity, its walls imbued with the sorrows and sins of those who had walked its halls. Each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of the wind, was a reminder of the lives that had been intertwined with this place. The house held their secrets, their joys and their sorrows, all woven into its very fabric. It was a place of whispers and shadows, where the line between the living and the dead blurred like watercolors on a canvas. The house seemed to exist in a realm of its own, a place where time stood still and the past was ever present. It was a place that beckoned to the curious, the brave and the foolish, promising them a glimpse into the unknown, a journey into the heart of darkness itself. The anniversary arrived cloaked in silence. A year since she vanished. John sat staring at the phone, the receiver cold and lifeless in his hand. He hadn't taken it off the hook, not since that last call. The one where the voice on the other end, small and afraid, had whispered, "Daddy," before dissolving into static.
"It's been a year,"
Mary whispered, her voice raspy, unused. John remained silent, his gaze fixed on the phone. A year of dead ends, of false hope, of gnawing guilt. The weight of it pressed down on him, threatening to crush him.
"We have to move on,"
Mary said, her voice cracking. John finally looked up, his eyes meeting Mary's. Move on? How could they move on when a piece of them was still lost in the shadows? The restaurant buzzed with forced gaiety. The air was thick with the scent of various dishes, a blend of spices and aromas that should have been appetizing but felt overwhelming. The clatter of cutlery and the hum of conversation created a cacophony that seemed to press in on John from all sides. The clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the overly cheerful music, it all grated on John's nerves. He felt a sense of dissonance, as if he were out of sync with the world around him. The laughter and joy that filled the room seemed like a cruel mockery of his own inner turmoil. 2 years. 2 years since their lives had been shattered. The passage of time had done little to heal the wounds. Each day felt like a struggle, a battle to maintain a facade of normalcy. The calendar might have flipped through the months, but the pain remained as fresh as ever. 2 years of pretending to be normal, to be whole. They had become experts at it, wearing masks that hid their true feelings. But tonight, in this crowded restaurant, the masks felt heavier than ever. The weight of their shared grief was almost palpable, a silent presence at their table. He glanced at Mary, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The lines of worry and sorrow etched into her features were starkly visible. She looked fragile, as if a single harsh word could shatter her completely. The light seemed to drain the color from her face, leaving her looking ghostly and ethereal. She picked at her food, her eyes distant, haunted. Each bite seemed to be an effort, a mechanical action devoid of any real interest or appetite. Her mind was clearly elsewhere, lost in memories that were too painful to revisit, but impossible to forget. A family entered the restaurant, their laughter jarring in the tense silence John carried with him. The sight of them, so carefree and happy, was like a knife twisting in his heart. He envied their innocence, their unburdened joy. It was a stark contrast to the heavy sorrow that weighed him down. He watched as they were led to a table, his gaze drawn to a young girl trailing behind them. There was something about her that caught his attention, a familiarity that tugged at the edges of his consciousness. He couldn't look away, his eyes following her every move. Her hair, the color of wheat in sunlight, fell in waves around her shoulders. It shimmered in the light, a golden halo that seemed almost otherworldly. The sight of it brought a rush of memories, bittersweet and painful. Her eyes, large and bright, held a spark of mischief. They were the kind of eyes that seemed to see everything, to understand more than they should. There was a liveliness in them that was both captivating and heartbreaking. John's breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. The resemblance was too strong, too uncanny. It was as if he were seeing a ghost, a spectre from his past come to haunt him. His heart pounded in his chest, a wild, frantic rhythm. He couldn't tear his gaze away. Every instinct screamed at him to look closer, to be sure. But the more he looked, the more certain he became. It was like a dream, a cruel trick of the mind. The girl's laugh, high and clear, sent shivers down his spine. It was a sound he had thought he would never hear again, a melody that had been silenced by tragedy. The familiarity of it was both a comfort and a torment. It was her laugh, his daughter's laugh. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, overwhelming and inescapable. It brought with it a flood of memories, each one more painful than the last, but that was impossible. His daughter was gone. The rational part of his mind fought against the hope that was rising within him. It couldn't be her. It was just a coincidence, a cruel twist of fate. Mary shifted beside him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. The warmth of her touch was a grounding force, a reminder that he was not alone in his grief. She had always been his anchor, the one who kept him from drifting away into despair.
John? What is it? Her voice was soft, filled with concern. She could sense his distress, the turmoil that was roiling within him. She had always been attuned to his emotions, able to read him like an open book.
He wanted to tell her, to share the impossible hope that had taken root in his heart, but he was afraid. Afraid of what it would mean, of the pain it could bring. The words hovered on the tip of his tongue, but he couldn't bring himself to say them. To say, "Look, it's her, our little girl." The words echoed in his mind, a desperate plea. He wanted to believe it, needed to believe it. But the fear of being wrong, of reopening old wounds, held him back. But the words died in his throat. He couldn't voice the hope that was clawing at his insides. It was too fragile, too precious. He was terrified of shattering it, of losing it forever. Hope, that flickering flame he'd tried so hard to extinguish, flared back to life, threatening to consume him. It was a dangerous thing, hope. It could lift you up, but it could also bring you crashing down. And yet, in that moment, He couldn't help but hold on to it, even if it was just for a little while longer. The house was silent as John slipped through the front door. The night was still, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves outside. He moved with the caution of someone who had done this many times before, each step calculated to avoid the creaky floorboards. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. It was a rhythm he couldn't control, a physical manifestation of the turmoil inside him. Every beat seemed louder than the last, echoing in the silence of the house. He closed the door softly behind him, the click echoing in the stillness. The sound was almost deafening in the quiet, a stark reminder of the secrecy of his actions. He paused for a moment, listening for any signs of movement, but the house remained silent. In the living room, bathed in the pale moonlight streaming through the grimy windows, sat Mary. She looked like a ghost, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. The moonlight cast eerie shadows on the walls, adding to the surreal atmosphere.
John, where have you been? Her voice trembled, the worry evident in every syllable. She had been waiting, the hours stretching into an eternity, each minute filled with dread.
Her voice was sharp, laced with worry and a hint of accusation. He didn't answer. He couldn't find the words to explain, to justify his actions. The weight of his secret pressed down on him, making it hard to breathe. He couldn't. Not yet. The truth was too heavy, too complicated. He needed more time, but time was a luxury he didn't have. Instead, he stepped aside, revealing the small figure standing behind him. The child had been hidden in the shadows, her presence a secret he had guarded fiercely. A girl, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity, peered out from behind him. She clung to his leg, her small hands gripping his pants tightly. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar surroundings. Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The shock was evident on her face, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the child. She had not expected this, not in her wildest dreams.
John, who is that? Her voice was barely a whisper, the question hanging in the air between them. She needed answers, but she was afraid of what they might be.
She's ours, Mary. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying tension. He knew this was a lot to take in, and he braced himself for her reaction.
The girl took a hesitant step forward, her eyes never leaving Mary's face. She was scared, but there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes, a longing for acceptance.
Mommy? Her voice was small, tentative. She was seeking confirmation, a connection to the woman standing before her.
She whispered, her voice barely audible. The word hung in the air, a fragile thread connecting the past and the present. Tears streamed down Mary's face as she rushed to the girl, engulfing her in a hug so tight it was almost painful. The emotions were overwhelming, a flood of relief, joy and sorrow all at once. John watched, a strange mix of relief and dread washing over him. He had done what he thought was right, but the consequences were still unknown. He'd brought her home, but at what cost? The future was uncertain, and the weight of his decision pressed heavily on his shoulders. He could only hope that they would find a way to move forward together.